Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was upon a bleak evening in early November of the year 1894 that this peculiar affair first presented itself to our attention, though I scarcely suspected, upon its arrival, how deep its peculiarities would run. A thick fog, which had lingered obstinately since the afternoon, curled against the window panes of 221B Baker Street, blurring the flickering gas lamps beyond into dim halos of gold. Holmes had been silent for the better part of an hour, slumped in his familiar armchair, the inevitable plume of strong black shag wreathing about his head, like the thoughts that so often occupied it. I had taken to my journal, a practice, I must confess, often inspired by long periods of Holmes' enigmatic silences, when the distant sound of footsteps, hurried and uneven, broke the stillness of the hour. Holmes stirred at last, though not in response to the approaching visitor. With a sudden burst of energy, as was his custom during these fitful intervals, he seized his Stradivarius and drew from it a series of wild, discordant notes that could scarcely be called music. Then, just as abruptly, he tossed the instrument aside and turned his attention to the small brass fragment lying upon the table. With eyes narrowed in intense scrutiny, he subjected it to a curious succession of chemical tests, muttering to himself in clipped bursts, snatches of German terminology mingled with his own cryptic deductions. I knew better than to interrupt these peculiar rituals. Indeed, it was only Holmes's mind, ever restless, which moved more unpredictably than his hands. The rap at the door was so sudden and forceful that both Holmes and I started, a rare feat indeed for my friend. His eyes gleamed with sudden interest, and with one finger raised to his lips, he silently commanded me to observe. I opened the door to a silhouette half consumed by the fog, a man whose urgency hung about him like his damp overcoat. Holmes, even before the man spoke, had already taken note, his glance darting to the man's gloves, shoes, and coat pocket, each, I knew, quietly volunteering information to that insatiable mind. The figure that stumbled inside was gaunt, his hollow cheeks and frenzied eyes suggesting either prolonged sleeplessness or a burdened conscience, perhaps both. His fingers, which clutched a small velvet pouch, were stained with black ink, while his left eye twitched involuntarily every few seconds, like the mechanism of a faulty timepiece. I must speak with Mr. Holmes," he stammered, his voice raspy, as if his throat had grown unused to speech. "It is a matter of life and death." Holmes, who had already risen, observed him with a detached curiosity, not unlike a naturalist studying some unfamiliar species thrust into his laboratory. "Horace Blackwood," said Holmes smoothly. "Clockmaker, if I am not mistaken. Your apprentice was dismissed a fortnight ago. Your workbench has been moved, recently and hastily, and you have a habit of wiping your spectacles on your left sleeve." The man's jaw fell open. "Curious," Holmes added, "that you carry the scent of oil and brass, yet the cut of your coat is more suited to Mayfair than Clerkenwell. A craftsman, yes, but with secrets of his own." With that, Holmes waved him to the chair opposite, and thus began the most sinister case to ever pass through Baker Street. Blackwood seated himself upon the very edge of the chair, his bony hands clasped tightly together, as though fearful they might betray him further if left unattended. His gaze darted between Holmes and the hearth, where the fire crackled with disinterested cheerfulness, oblivious to the man's evident distress. "It began with the ticking," he said, his voice strained and uneven. "At first, I thought nothing of it, a harmless peculiarity, a trick of the ear. In a clockmaker's workshop, ticking is the very air we breathe. Holmes steepled his fingers, his grey eyes half-lidded in feigned indifference. But this was no ordinary ticking, I presume? Blackwood gave a jerking nod. It came from nowhere. Clocks that had long ceased to function sprang to life, though no mainspring turned within them. Parts would vanish from my bench only to reappear hours later, arranged in curious patterns, spirals, crosses, even a crude figure resembling a human heart. Curious indeed, murmured Holmes. And you are quite certain no one else has access to your workshop? None, said Blackwood, voice barely above a whisper. Save for my apprentice. But he would not. No, it is impossible. Nothing is impossible, said Holmes. Only improbable. The clockmaker's trembling hand ventured to his brow, wiping away a sheen of sweat, though the room was comfortably warm. There was fear in every movement, fear of some unseen hand, adjusting the very mechanisms of his life. 2 nights ago, Blackwood continued, I found my apprentice, young Asher, collapsed beside the grand regulator, my father's proudest creation. The name stirred some flicker of recognition in Holmes, though he said nothing. Blackwood pressed on. The boy was pale as death, his hand curled into a fist around a broken cogwheel, and the clock itself. Blackwood's voice faltered. Its hands had been deliberately reversed. Midnight stood where noon should be, and the pendulum swung in silence, as though time itself had been inverted. Holmes's eyes sharpened at this. Your apprentice. What did he recall upon waking? Nothing, Blackwood whispered. He swore he had been locking up the workshop when a dreadful ticking filled the air. And then, darkness, as if some spell had been cast. Fascinating, said Holmes, his fingers drumming softly upon his knee. The reversed hands, Watson, the mark of deliberate tampering, time undone, as it were. It appears, my dear fellow, we are dealing not only with a craftsman, but with a mind possessing a certain flair for the theatrical. The clockmaker's agitation grew as he reached the most peculiar element of his tale. There was, he said, voice lowered conspiratorially, a commission. A private request from a man whose face I never saw. His messenger arrived just before dusk, a fortnight past, bearing precise specifications for a custom pocket watch. The mechanism was intricate beyond measure, finer than any I had ever crafted. Holmes leaned forward slightly, the only indication of his growing interest. The design called for a double escapement, a triple-layered mainspring, and an engraving inside the case, a phrase in German, which I had to have translated. And the phrase? Holmes prompted. Zum 13. Stundenschlag, sagte Blackwood. The 13th chime, Holmes translated softly. Indeed. Blackwood swallowed hard. But the watch, it vanished before completion, and in its place, he reached into his velvet pouch and withdrew a twisted mechanical object, half clockwork, half atrocity. It resembled a human heart, but its beat was irregular, and the tiny gears within pulsed with grotesque precision. Holmes took it gingerly, holding it to his ear. A smile, faint but unmistakable, touched his lips. You see, Watson, he said, the man has not merely lost his craft, he has lost his mind. Holmes had listened to Blackwood's trembling account with the detached air of a man inspecting an object of mild curiosity, his fingers steepled beneath his chin and his gaze half-shuttered. But now, with a sudden flicker of animation, he leaned forward, his eyes sweeping over Blackwood like a hawk surveying the landscape below. Your sleeves, said Holmes, are stained not merely with oil, but with burgundy lacquer, a colour rarely used outside of high-precision escapement work. Blackwood blinked in confusion, but Holmes was already pressing on. The callus on your left index finger is triangular, which suggests you routinely brace small components against it, likely while adjusting pinions or jewel bearings. Moreover, your twitch, an involuntary spasm in the levator palpebrae superioris muscle, is a common affliction of men who strain through a loop for hours at a time. Watson, as ever, found himself suspended between admiration and bewilderment. And your spectacles, added Holmes, were repaired recently, By yourself, no doubt, hence the uneven tightening of the left hinge. All these point to a man whose life is governed by minuscule precision, but whose nerves are increasingly at odds with that delicate world. Holmes reclined once more. I should think, Watson, that our guest is hiding more than a trembling hand. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably, and Holmes's gaze flicked briefly to the man's boots. Curious, said Holmes, that the wear on your soles is inconsistent. The outer edge is smooth from pavement walking, but the inner heel bears a peculiar diagonal scrape, one I have only observed in men who descend narrow ladders with regularity. Ladders, I echoed. Indeed. And the faint line of residual machine oil at the hem of his trousers, Watson, is not from his workbench, but from some hidden mechanism, likely below ground level. Blackwood paled. There is a cellar of sorts, but I have not set foot there in years. Holmes's smile was faint and entirely devoid of surprise. There is no object more attractive to mystery than a room its owner chooses to forget. With that, Holmes rose. Come, Watson, it appears we have a descent to make. As we followed Blackwood's reluctant footsteps to the street, Holmes's eyes drifted, as they often did, to details I would have dismissed entirely. German, said Holmes abruptly. I glanced about, puzzled. What is? Your shoes, Blackwood, Holmes said mildly. They bear a thin residue of amber lubricant, a proprietary formula used only in the automaton workshops of Bavaria, where they specialize in self-winding figurines and death clocks. Blackwood's hands clenched involuntarily, but Holmes, with a wave of his own hand, silenced the protest before it could emerge. This heart of yours, said Holmes, tapping the velvet pouch Blackwood still carried, was no work of English craftsmanship. Its maker was foreign. German precision married to macabre purpose, a rare and exceedingly dangerous union. Holmes's smile was thin and predatory. Tell me, Blackwood, when did Otto Krause's name first appear in your father's ledgers? It was not long before Holmes had summoned a cab, and we set off toward Clerkenwell, where Blackwood's workshop stood amidst a row of modest tradesmen's establishments. The air grew heavier with the scent of oil, metal filings, and the faint, almost medicinal tang of brass polish, an atmosphere Holmes seemed to inhale with distinct satisfaction. The shop itself was a study in mechanical chaos. Wheels, pinions, and coiled springs lay scattered across benches, while timepieces in every stage of disassembly loomed around us. Each clock ticked at its own pace, creating a fragmented chorus of time, discordant yet strangely hypnotic. It was a room governed by machinery rather than man. Holmes moved through this sea of ticking metal with the sure-footedness of a naturalist in familiar territory, touching nothing but seeing all. Blackwood hovered behind him like a schoolboy before a stern master, wringing his hands and stammering unnecessary apologies for the disorder. Order, said Holmes, is a matter of perspective. To a clockmaker, the chaos of wheels and springs is no different from the orderly rows of a soldier's kit. Blackwood's smile was nervous, but Holmes had already moved ahead, his gaze sweeping upward toward the skylight. Without a word, Holmes withdrew his magnifying lens and began a slow circuit of the room, starting at the door and ending at the ceiling's apex. His attention settled upon the skylight latch, where his fingers paused briefly before moving on. 2 nights ago, you said, Holmes murmured, half to himself. Yes, Mr. Holmes, Blackwood replied. But… Holmes waved him to silence. His hands, agile and sure, traced a thin line of discoloration along the frame, invisible to my untrained eye. Beside the window, a small streak of soot and brass dust had settled where no ordinary draught could have placed it. The intruder, said Holmes, was not some ghostly agent, but a rather practical one, possessing both familiarity with your workshop and a preference for unorthodox entries. I marvelled at Holmes's certainty, though I had by now learned to restrain my questions until his mind had fully turned its wheel. When at last he turned, it was with a small, satisfied nod. Whoever came that night, Holmes concluded, was both careful and deliberate, and they knew precisely where to look. Holmes had already fixed his gaze upon a narrow shelf set into the far wall, its surface crowded with small leather-bound volumes, all of them covered in a fine layer of metallic dust. "These books," he said, "have been handled recently, and not by you, Blackwood." The clockmaker's eyes widened. "But they contain nothing of value, only notes on escapement mechanisms, adjustments to older models, and such." "Precisely," said Holmes. "Notes so meticulously annotated that one might assume a scholar at work. Yet here," he opened a volume at random. "The handwriting abruptly changes. These marginalia, Watson, belong to another hand entirely." He held the book toward me, where I saw cramped German script overlaying Blackwood's own elegant notes. I could make little of the meaning, though certain phrases stood out: mainspring inversion, oscillation reversal, and one particularly chilling term: pulsing heart drive. "Whoever added these," Holmes remarked, "was not merely tinkering. They were attempting to reverse the very nature of timekeeping itself." Holmes closed the book with a snap and turned to Blackwood. "Your shop has been a library for someone else's obsession." While Holmes busied himself with the books, my own attention was drawn to a bundle of papers protruding from a cracked leather folder beside the shelf. One corner had been partially burned, as though hastily thrust into the fire before second thoughts intervened. I retrieved the papers and unfolded them, revealing a letter dated nearly 20 years earlier, addressed to Horace Blackwood Sr. Holmes took it from my hand, scanning the page in silence before reading aloud. "By agreeing to the terms of the Timekeeper's Pact, you bind yourself and your descendants to the guardianship of the clock. None may alter its workings save the hand that forged it, and none may possess it without the price of time itself." "What devilry is this?" I asked. Holmes handed the letter back with a faint smile. "A relic of London's old Clockmakers' Guild, Watson, a society known for its peculiar mixture of mechanical brilliance and medieval superstition." Blackwood slumped into a chair, his face pale. "My father never spoke of this," he whispered. "For a moment, I could see, but the Grand Regulator, he said it must never stop, for fear of disturbing its spirit." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Now, my dear Watson, the real work begins. It is perhaps not widely known outside certain trades, but the London Guild of Clockmakers, though officially a fraternity of craftsmen, had long been whispered about in more superstitious quarters. Even as a medical man, I had heard curious tales, mostly from my time in army hospitals, where officers would spin London legends to amuse convalescent soldiers. There was talk of a secret order within the guild, men who believed that timepieces were more than machines, that wheels and springs could do more than measure time. According to these rumors, a select few believed that through precise craftsmanship, ritual calibrations, and knowledge passed in encoded ledgers, a clock could be made to influence the soul of the man who owned it. A cursed clock, so they said, might hasten its owner's death. A blessed one might stave off fate itself. I had always dismissed such stories as the idle fancy of men too long isolated with their tools, but Holmes had never fully shared my skepticism. More than once he remarked that superstition often masked truth too unpalatable to confront directly. As Holmes continued his examination of the workshop, I found my thoughts circling back to the Timekeeper's Pact, that peculiar phrase from the letter. If Blackwood's father had indeed bound himself to some ancient mechanical covenant, and if his son had now unwittingly inherited the same burden, then perhaps we stood at the threshold of something darker than simple theft. Holmes's hand paused suddenly above a dusty cuckoo clock resting upon a low shelf near the rear of the workshop. It was unremarkable in design, a Bavarian model of middling craftsmanship, the sort commonly sold in seaside shops for the amusement of visitors. Yet Holmes's fingers traced the wood with unusual care, tapping 3 times at the base of the case. A soft click followed, and the back panel slid open to reveal a hollow compartment within. "Watson," he said with quiet triumph, "this was no ordinary clock. This was a signal device, favoured once by smuggling syndicates along the Thames. A single cog removed or inserted would trigger a silent alarm within a matching clock elsewhere, a means of alerting accomplices when customs agents came too near. Blackwood stared in disbelief. But my father would never— Your father, Holmes said, was part of a generation that knew survival depended as much on secrecy as on skill. It appears this workshop has ticked in tune with many secrets, some mechanical, others criminal. With a flick of his wrist, Holmes reset the panel, the cuckoo returning to its slumber. A useful relic, he mused, but not the only secret this room holds. Holmes turned his attention once more to the skylight, his previous examination incomplete. Producing his magnifying lens, he examined the inner ledge, brushing his fingertip gently across the narrow lip of wood. When he withdrew his hand, a thin smear of soot and fine brass dust marred his glove. A visitor, Holmes said quietly, and one with considerable mechanical knowledge. Watson-like curiosity overwhelmed me. How can you know that from mere soot? Holmes gave a smile, the sort reserved for particularly elementary proofs. Consider, Watson, the common burglar seeks valuables, not timepieces. Yet this individual disturbed only the bookshelves and left no trace near the cash drawer. Moreover, the nature of the residue, brass, not iron or coal, indicates delicate handling, for brass dust settles only where fine adjustments have been made. He bent low, tracing a finger along the floor beneath the skylight. See here, the imprint of a narrow heel plate, of foreign make. I would wager, Watson, that our visitor came equipped not merely to steal, but to interfere directly with Blackwood's devices. Holmes straightened, eyes bright with deduction. It is not what was taken that concerns me. It is what was left behind. I confess I did not yet understand the full import of his words, but I had known Holmes long enough to trust that understanding would come, if not by logic, then when fate itself struck the hour. Holmes took the grotesque mechanical heart from Blackwood's trembling hands, his expression one of scientific detachment rather than revulsion. With the faintest of smiles, he crossed the room, set the device upon our small side table, and withdrew his magnifying lens from his pocket. This, Watson, he remarked, is craftsmanship of a type rarely seen in England. Observe the balance spring. It has been counterweighted with surgical precision, such that the irregularity in its ticking is deliberate, not the result of a fault. He held the lens just above the surface of the outer casing, tilting the heart slightly so that the candlelight caught upon a thin band of metal running along its seam. Nothing but dull brass, worn slightly from handling. But Holmes, his keen eye unerring, drew in a quick breath. There, he said softly. Micro-etching, Watson. A signature. I leaned closer, but Holmes shook his head. Even with your fine military eyesight, you would struggle to detect it without aid. Yet it is unmistakable. The hand that built this is no amateur in clockwork monstrosities. Holmes straightened, returning the lens to his pocket. We are no longer dealing with a common thief, nor even a mere eccentric. This piece carries the hallmark of one man alone, and his name is not unknown to me. Blackwood stared, bewildered. Whose name, Mr. Holmes? Holmes smiled faintly. Otto Kraus, he said. And with that, our mystery has grown considerably darker. Even I, who had no intimate knowledge of the horological underworld, recognized the name. Otto Kraus, a craftsman whose genius was exceeded only by his infamy. Surely not the Otto Kraus, I exclaimed. The man who vanished after the Linz affair, when a prominent banker's heart allegedly stopped the very moment his pocket watch ceased ticking. The very same, Holmes said with satisfaction. Kraus was an artist in murder by mechanism, capable of designing timepieces that could regulate life itself. His reputation, both feared and revered, was built upon the premise that guilt could be measured in oscillations, and that a man whose conscience betrayed him would unwittingly trigger his own demise. Blackwood's face had turned the colour of old parchment. But my father, he never consorted with criminals. Perhaps not, Holmes allowed. But when a man's obsession with time eclipses his better judgment, he might seek the services of those whose morality bends to their craft. Holmes turned the heart over once more in his hand, the grotesque object ticking faintly like a pulse from beyond the grave. This, he said, was no common trinket. It is both a warning and a clue. By the following morning, Holmes had directed our inquiries toward the oldest horologist in London, a man known only as Merrick, who had retired from the trade but retained a memory as precise as the movements he once assembled. "You'll want to know about the commission then," said Merrick, after Holmes had introduced the matter. "It was old Blackwood himself who came knocking back in '77, asking after Krauss." "Why Krauss?" Holmes asked. "Surely London had no shortage of capable craftsmen." "Not for what Blackwood wanted," said Merrick grimly. "He had a theory, you see, that a clock could do more than measure time. He believed it could act as a kind of confessor, a moral barometer capable of sensing a man's guilt and, if tampered with, stopping his heart dead. I could not suppress a shudder at the sheer madness of the notion. Holmes, however, seemed entirely unfazed. "And Krauss built it?" "He did," said Merrick. "A pocket watch, outwardly unremarkable, but within, a dual escapement, one regular, the other sensitive to the faintest tremor in the wearer's pulse." "And what became of it?" I asked. Merrick shrugged. "Vanished after old Blackwood died. Krauss disappeared not long after. Rumour was he'd built a second piece, a prototype so unnatural that no sane man would wear it." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "You mean the heart?" "Aye," said Merrick. "They said he wanted to create a timepiece that could beat without a mainspring, a heart that ticked with a man's own fear." Holmes pocketed his notebook. "Come, Watson, it appears we are chasing not merely a thief, but a legacy of madness passed from father to son." "Of all the artifacts to vanish from this workshop," said Holmes, "none could be more dangerous than the original commission, the prototype that Otto Krauss built for Blackwood's father. The mere mention of it made our client visibly shudder." "It was no ordinary timepiece," Holmes continued. "Krauss's genius lay not merely in precision, but in philosophical engineering, if one can use the phrase. This was no watch to merely mark the passage of time. It was designed to judge the conscience of its bearer." I stared at Holmes, uncertain whether I had heard correctly. "Judge the conscience?" "Precisely," said Holmes. "A mechanism so finely attuned that any interference, deliberate or accidental, by hands burdened with guilt, would trigger the cessation of its function, thereby ceasing the life of its possessor." Blackwood's voice was barely a whisper. "Then, my father knew." "Not only knew," said Holmes, "but ensured its disappearance was no accident. The watch was a loaded weapon, Watson, a death sentence ticking softly in a man's pocket." The notion chilled me far more than any common murder. This was not crime as I knew it. This was fate, mechanized. For all his brilliance in untangling the facts before us, I could not help but notice a peculiar reservation in Holmes's manner. Though I pressed him for his complete theory, Holmes offered only a fragmentary outline, as if some inner calculation had not yet concluded. "There are certain elements," he said, "that are better left unspoken until necessity demands." I knew Holmes well enough to detect the faint glimmer of unease in his tone, though it was masked behind his usual sang-froid. What disturbed me most was the fact that his reticence seemed less scientific than personal, as though he had glimpsed something in this case that trespassed beyond the realm of deduction. "What is it you are not telling me, Holmes?" I asked. He gave me one of his rare, almost pitying smiles. "You are a man of medicine, Watson, and yet there are phenomena even your training cannot prepare you for. This is a case where time, guilt, and perhaps something darker intersect." Though I begged him for clarity, Holmes merely gestured toward the window, where the clocks of London counted down the night. "In time," he said softly. "All in time." As we walked back toward Baker Street, Holmes at last broke his silence, though his words, instead of clarifying, only deepened my sense of unease. "Have you ever heard, Watson, of the belief that a man's soul can be caught within a machine?" he asked. I laughed softly. "Surely that is the province of superstition, Holmes." "One would think," he said. Yet the inner circle of the Clockmakers' Guild held this belief quite seriously. They spoke of the binding principle, the notion that a craftsman's intent could be infused into his work, such that the clock would not merely measure time, but carry the weight of its creator's spirit. I scoffed at the idea, but Holmes continued. "Consider this, Watson. What if the guilt of a crime could be transferred into the very mechanism that recorded its moment? What if the watch on a murderer's wrist could feel his heartbeat, measure his fear, and ultimately condemn him without judge or jury?" It was a grotesque notion, and yet Holmes's tone was not mocking. He spoke with the same dispassionate analysis he applied to the chemical composition of tobacco ash. "If Blackwood's father truly believed such a thing," Holmes said, "then that watch was no mere timepiece. It was a prison cell for guilt itself, and whoever possesses it now holds more than brass and springs." He said no more, but I could feel the weight of his meaning settle heavily between us. That very evening, a new element entered our investigation, one that left even Holmes momentarily surprised. "An observer," Holmes said, drawing back the curtain at Baker Street and watching the street below. "She has been watching Blackwood's shop for 3 nights running, always at the stroke of midnight." The figure was unmistakable, a woman in full mourning attire, her face obscured beneath a black veil, standing motionless beneath the lamplight. "Who is she?" I asked. "That, Watson, is precisely what we shall uncover," Holmes replied. "No ordinary widow stands vigil at such an hour, outside such a shop, unless she too bears some connection to the ticking heart of this case." Holmes's eyes gleamed with something between curiosity and challenge. "A woman in mourning," he said softly. "And if I am not mistaken, her grief is mechanical rather than romantic." Before I could press him to explain, the woman turned sharply, retreating into the fog with the deliberate grace of one who knows she is being watched. "She knows we are observing her," Holmes murmured, "which means she will not appear again unless we set the clocks for her return." Holmes lit his pipe, the fragrant smoke curling through the air as he leaned back in his chair. "Understand this, Watson," he said. "This is no ordinary case of theft or blackmail. This is a philosophical crime, a puzzle whose solution lies not merely in deduction, but in the nature of time itself." I stared at him, baffled. "Time, Holmes. Time, guilt, and the unforgiving machinery that binds them," Holmes replied. "The clock is no passive observer in this affair. It is both witness and executioner. Every second that passes does not merely record events. It measures the weight of the soul." His words unnerved me in a way no grisly murder scene ever had. For Holmes to speak in such almost metaphysical terms meant that he had glimpsed something within this case that had unsettled even his rational mind. "It breathes, Watson," he said softly. "This puzzle breathes, and every cog within it turns towards some predestined conclusion." I asked what that conclusion might be, but Holmes only gave his ghost of a smile and returned to his pipe. "We shall know," he said at last, "when the 13th hour strikes." Holmes stood in Blackwood's cluttered workshop, his gaze moving from one clock face to the next, as though consulting a jury of silent witnesses. The room, with its constant clicking and shifting, seemed alive with treachery, each pendulum swinging to some secret rhythm only Holmes could perceive. "Watson," he said, "we must speak to our visitor in a language they understand, the language of time itself." Without further explanation, he crossed to the nearest regulator clock, adjusting its brass hands to 13 minutes past midnight. He moved with frenzied precision, resetting each and every clock, mantelpieces, long cases, even the small pocket models resting half disassembled on Blackwood's bench. All were synchronized to the same unnatural hour. 13 minutes past 12, Holmes remarked, is a signal known to precisely one man, Otto Kraus. "But Kraus is gone," I objected. His methods remain, Holmes said, and those who follow his work, the inheritors of his secrets, will recognize this summons as surely as a hound knows the huntsman's horn. Blackwood stood pale and bewildered, offering no objection as Holmes rewound his entire world to match the hidden signal. The clock's hands crawled into place, and at once the room seemed charged with expectancy, as though time itself had paused to listen. Holmes stepped back, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "Now," he said softly, "we have announced ourselves to the hand that winds in darkness." With that, he beckoned me into the shadowed corner behind a wall of grandfather clocks, where we would wait for the response only a guilty soul could send. The workshop at night was a far more sinister place than it had appeared by day. There was no true silence, only the ceaseless ticking, like 1,000 tiny conspiracies, whispering over one another in the dark. The air itself felt weighted, thick with the scent of oil and brass, mingled with the sour tang of long-held fear. Holmes, seated cross-legged beside me, seemed perfectly at ease, his fingers steepled and his expression somewhere between meditation and anticipation. I, however, found the waiting unbearable. Each tick seemed to announce some unseen presence drawing closer, and more than once I started at shadows that proved to be nothing more than restless machinery. "Holmes," I whispered at last, "do you truly expect someone to come?" He smiled faintly. "Expectation, Watson, is a luxury. I know they will come." "But who? The thief? The veiled woman?" "Patience," Holmes said, his voice no louder than the ticking. "She is neither thief nor ghost. She is the keeper of a clockwork sin, and tonight we hold the key that winds her fate." Before I could press him further, a faint metallic creak sounded from the skylight above. "The hour approaches," Holmes whispered. "Steady yourself, my dear fellow. The clock strikes for her." At precisely 13 minutes past midnight, the latch of the skylight lifted with the cautious delicacy of a practiced hand. A figure descended in silence, her movements too graceful for a common intruder. Even in the dim light, her identity was unmistakable. The woman in mourning veils. She moved as though guided by memory, stepping past the cluttered workbenches and shattered gears until she stood before the grand regulator, its reversed hands glowing faintly in the lantern's light. For several moments, she simply stood there, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly before her as if she were praying, or confessing, to the machine itself. Holmes placed a hand upon my arm, holding me back, and I felt his tension like a wire drawn taut. With a deliberate slowness, the woman drew back her veil. Her face, pale and angular, was framed by dark hair streaked with silver. Grief had hollowed her cheeks, but her eyes held something far colder than sorrow. She withdrew a small brass key from her sleeve, fitting it into a hidden recess at the base of the regulator. The clock shuddered, its pendulum jerking violently, and Holmes rose to his feet at once. "Madam, you wind more than a clock tonight," he said aloud. "You wind the last hour of your father's sin." She turned sharply, her hand trembling at the sound of his voice, but there was no fear in her eyes, only recognition. Holmes stepped forward, his hands outstretched in a gesture I had come to recognize, part reassurance, part authority. "Remove the veil," he said, his voice calm, but unmistakably firm. The woman's gloved fingers trembled only slightly as she complied. The veil fell away, revealing a face that bore the sharp bones of youth, but the eyes of someone much older, eyes that had seen ruin, grief, and fear distilled into years that no clock could measure. "Anneliese Krauss, I presume," Holmes said. A flicker of something, pride, perhaps, crossed her gaunt features before she nodded. "I see my reputation precedes me." "Not reputation," said Holmes. "Inheritance. Your father's craftsmanship was unique. His sins, it seems, have fallen upon his child." She straightened, though her fingers still trembled upon the brass key in her hand. "I came to reclaim what was stolen from him." "Stolen!" I exclaimed. "But the death clock was his own creation." Her smile was bitter. So you believe the lies London tells itself? You think Otto Kraus invented the clock of death? No, gentlemen, the true architect of that horror was not my father at all. Holmes's brow lifted slightly, but he said nothing. He was waiting for the confession to complete itself, as it always did. And complete itself it did, in words laced with venom. The man who built the first death clock was Horace Blackwood, the elder. The very walls seemed to contract around us, the tick of every clock receding into silence beneath the weight of her words. My father was a master craftsman, yes, Annalise said, her voice unsteady. But he was no murderer. It was Blackwood, the elder Blackwood, who conceived of the death clock, who sketched the schematics into his secret ledger. But when the guild learned of it, the scandal would have ruined him. I saw Blackwood, the son, clutch at the workbench for support, his face pale. My father was a respected horologist, he croaked. He was a coward, Annalise spat. He needed someone to take the blame, someone whose reputation was already tainted by eccentricity. My father was an outsider, a Bavarian craftsman among English guildmen, easy prey for a lie. I turned to Holmes, but his expression was unreadable. A chess player, considering both sides of the board. And your father fled, Holmes said quietly. Disgraced and hunted. Not hunted, Annalise corrected. Haunted, by guilt, by suspicion, by the knowledge that a clock capable of killing had been made by his hands, even if the design was not his own. That guilt poisoned him until every tick of the clocks in his workshop sounded like a heartbeat calling for justice. She drew a ragged breath. I came to recover the prototype, to clear my father's name. But now, her voice faltered. I see there is more than justice at work here. Holmes nodded. More indeed, Miss Kraus, for justice rarely ticks with such irregularity. Before anyone could speak further, a sharp click echoed through the room, and the grotesque mechanical heart, which Holmes had placed atop the bench, gave a single convulsive shudder. Its malformed gears began to turn, faster than before, the ticking irregular and frantic, like a pulse under duress. Holmes, I cried, what have you done? Holmes was already moving, his gaze darting between the heart and Annalise. Not me, Watson, her. When she engaged the key in the regulator, she must have triggered the mechanism remotely. Annalise recoiled, her face pale. I touched nothing but the clock itself. Which is precisely the problem, Holmes said. The heart was never meant to work alone. It was a slave to the master clock, and now the master has called. The irregular ticking grew faster, each beat sharper, more insistent, until it sounded not like a clock at all, but like the ragged breathing of a dying man. Holmes's expression sharpened to something almost predatory. Watson, stand back. This is no longer a question of deduction. This is now a matter of survival. Holmes leaned over the mechanical heart, his hands hovering above it like a surgeon preparing to operate without anaesthetic. Do you smell it, Watson? He asked. I sniffed the air and detected nothing beyond the usual metal and oil. But Holmes's nose, keen as a bloodhound, detected far more. Hydrochloric reagent, faint but unmistakable. A trap set long before tonight. What does it mean? I demanded. Holmes smiled grimly. It means the heart was meant for me. He raised both hands. And to my horror, the faint chemical residue from his earlier analysis had left invisible traces on his fingertips. The heart, detecting the reagent, responded as if it had been touched by a guilty hand, and its frantic ticking accelerated further. A chemical trap, Holmes said softly, designed to trigger if exposed to the very compounds necessary to study it. Ingenious. His fingers twitched, but he held them back. If I touch it again, Watson, it will complete its work, and so shall I. I stood paralyzed, torn between shouting for help and smashing the infernal device beneath my heel. Holmes, however, remained as cool as ever. Fortunately, he said, the clock has not yet accounted for a violinist and his faithful doctor. Without hesitation, Holmes turned to me. "Watson, your penknife." I handed it over at once, my fingers clumsy with nerves. Holmes drew it along the edge of his violin case, extracting a single taut string, which he looped deftly around the ticking heart's exposed mainspring. "Music," he said with a faint smile, "has more uses than melody." With the string acting as an improvised tension wire, Holmes inserted the penknife's narrowest blade beneath the outer casing, prying it open just enough to disengage the secondary escapement.
The heart shuddered violently, its ticking slowing, then faltering altogether. Holmes withdrew his hands, the string still trembling faintly between his fingers. "And that," he said, "is what I call cutting it close." Relief overwhelmed me, and I nearly laughed. But the sight of Annalise Krauss, collapsed into a chair with tears in her eyes, sobered me at once. "You are not the trap's intended victim, Miss Krauss," Holmes said gently. "It was always meant for me. Someone wanted to ensure I followed the case to its final beat." Annalise lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "I had no part in the trap," she said, "but I know who set it." Holmes waited. "My father's apprentice," she whispered, "a man who learned every trick, every secret, and who believed the guild's true power was not in making time, but in ending it." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "His name?" "Leopold Greisner," she said. "They called him the Sinister Clockmaker, and he wants the death clock back." Holmes rose, brushing dust from his knees. "Then we have not ended this case, Watson. We have only wound it halfway." The journey back to Baker Street was taken in silence, save for the muffled clip of hooves against damp cobblestones and the faint, rhythmic clicking of Holmes's pocket watch. A mundane timepiece which, in that moment, I found strangely comforting. Holmes, for his part, sat with his hands loosely steepled, his fingers still bearing the faint scent of brass oil. I noted a dark smudge upon his left cuff, some residue from his desperate work upon the mechanical heart, but Holmes seemed oblivious to it, his mind already several moves ahead of my own. It was nearly dawn when we arrived at 221B, the fog thickening about our windows like a second curtain. Mrs. Hudson's customary grumbling was mercifully absent. Holmes had already paid her double rent for such midnight disturbances. Holmes dropped into his armchair with a sigh of satisfaction, stretching his long limbs toward the fire. Without a word, I prepared 2 strong brandies, for I knew my friend well enough to recognize the afterglow of intellectual victory when I saw it. "You have questions, Watson," he said at last, his eyes half closed. "I have several," I admitted, "and I trust you mean to answer them." Holmes took his time, as was his habit when untangling a particularly intricate knot. He leaned back, fingertips pressed together, and began. "From the first, Watson, the condition of Mr. Blackwood's hands spoke volumes. The precise distribution of oil stains and the peculiar calluses suggested prolonged work upon a delicate mechanism. That much was elementary. But the true revelation lay in the foreign oil beneath his fingernails, a compound used exclusively in Bavarian automaton factories." "Krauss," I said at once. "Precisely. A logical link, but not proof, until we discovered the annotated escapement books in a handwriting that was neither Blackwood's nor his apprentice's. It matched Krauss's hand, which I obtained some years ago from a colleague in Vienna." Holmes paused only to relight his pipe before continuing. The reversed hands upon the grand regulator were a deliberate signature, a signal to anyone familiar with Krauss's work that time itself had been tampered with. It was both a warning and an invitation. "And the letter, the timekeeper's pact?" I asked. "Ah," said Holmes, "a most intriguing relic. It confirmed that the Clockmakers' Guild had long been aware of experiments into psychological horology, the belief that guilt and fear could be measured in mechanical terms. That letter was both confession and prophecy, proof that Blackwood the elder and Krauss once worked side by side until betrayal drove them apart." I shook my head in disbelief. "But why the grotesque heart? Why the woman in the veil?" "Because," said Holmes, "a crime that involves the soul's measurement cannot be solved by mere logic. It required a test of character, of courage, of innocence itself. And that test, my dear Watson, was directed not at Blackwood, but at me. Holmes reached into his pocket, producing once more the mechanical heart, now silent and still. "Do you recall what I told you about the death clock's true purpose?" he asked. "It was not, as legend would have it, a mere device to kill its wearer." "No, it was a device designed to detect and punish guilt itself." I frowned. But how could a clock distinguish between guilt and innocence? Holmes smiled faintly. "By its tick." He placed the heart upon the table between us and gently wound it once more. It began to tick, but irregularly, its pace shifting between a steady rhythm and frantic stutters, almost as if it were alive. Krauss believed, Holmes continued, that a guilty man's pulse would betray him. The micromechanism within the clock was calibrated to detect changes in pressure, triggered by the merest tremor in a trembling hand. The more a man feared discovery, the faster the clock would run, until the final trigger released a poisoned pin into the wrist. I shuddered. Monstrous. Monstrous indeed, Holmes agreed, but also remarkable, for it combined mechanical ingenuity with the psychology of conscience. The clock itself was not a murder weapon. It was a mirror to the soul. I stared at the heart, its ticking slowing now under Holmes's careful hand. "But why was it meant for you?" I asked. "Because," Holmes said, "the sinister clockmaker, our hidden antagonist, believed that only one man stood between him and the reclamation of Krauss's legacy. That man was myself." He turned the heart over, revealing a second signature, almost invisible along the inner casing. The mark not of Otto Krauss, but of Leopold Greisner, Krauss's apprentice turned zealot. "It was Greisner who manipulated Annalisa into retrieving the prototype," Holmes said. "But before he allowed it into my hands, he calibrated it specifically for me, to react not to guilt, but to fear itself." I could hardly believe it. "You mean, the heart would only kill if you feared it would?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Precisely. It was a duel of nerves, Watson. If I had doubted myself, if my hand had so much as trembled, the heart would have completed its deadly work." "And yet you handled it without hesitation," I said. Holmes gave a slight shrug. "My conscience, though occasionally inconvenient, remains entirely intact." I exhaled slowly. "Then the test was not of guilt, but of your own unshakable belief in your methods." "Correct," said Holmes. "A test, my dear Watson, that only a man without fear of his own mind could ever pass." I set down my empty glass with unnecessary force, my emotions caught somewhere between profound admiration and the lingering sting of having been, yet again, kept largely in the dark. "Holmes," I said, "one day you shall drive me to the edge of sanity. Do you mean to tell me that throughout this entire ordeal, from Blackwood's trembling confession to that infernal heart nearly exploding in your hands, you knew the truth, yet left me stumbling in the shadows?" Holmes, who had returned to his customary repose, one leg stretched out toward the hearth, regarded me with his usual air of amused detachment. "My dear Watson," he said, "I have often remarked that your virtues lie chiefly in your heart, not your head. It is precisely because you approach these matters with such splendid humanity that I am able to see them with cold detachment. This explanation, offered with such maddening serenity, only deepened my sense of exasperation. Yet beneath it, I could not help but marvel at his uncanny poise. "You might have died," I muttered. "Possibly," Holmes admitted, "but one cannot solve a clockwork puzzle without letting the gears turn." He leaned back, smoke curling lazily from his pipe, and gazed at the mantel clock, its pendulum ticking with serene indifference. "Time," he said, "is a singularly overestimated adversary." I could not suppress a laugh. "You say that as though time itself were merely another criminal to apprehend." "In a sense it is," Holmes replied. "Every case, every crime, every pursuit, they all exist within the confines of time, do they not? And yet, time is no villain. It is a puzzle maker. It hides the answers behind veils of minutes and hours, daring us to look closer, to wind back the clock until cause and consequence align. He gestured toward the grotesque heart, now silent upon the table. Even that monstrosity, though capable of death, was ultimately a device for revealing truth. Truth measured not in morality, but in milliseconds. I shook my head. You speak of time as if it were a willing accomplice, not a force beyond human control. Holmes shrugged, the faintest smile playing at the corner of his lips. Perhaps, Watson, the greatest illusion of all is that time obeys any master but itself. The fire had burned low, and the first pale light of dawn had begun to filter through the curtains, before either of us spoke again. It was Holmes who broke the silence, his voice softer than usual, as though speaking less to me than to the shadows gathered in the corners of the room. "Do you believe in justice, Watson?" he asked. The question surprised me. "Of course I do." "And do you believe justice is best served swiftly, like a constable's whistle cutting the night? Or does true justice unfold over time, shaped by circumstance, intent, and the frailty of human nature?" I had no ready answer. Holmes did not seem to require one. "This clock," he said, tapping the brass heart with one long finger, "sought to measure guilt in seconds, to reduce the complexities of conscience to the crude mathematics of rhythm and pulse." He shook his head. "Such a notion is an insult to both justice and time itself. Guilt is not a matter of heartbeat, but of choice."
And time does not march toward justice. It merely records whether men seek it or evade it. I was struck by his unusual earnestness. "Then you believe fate plays no part?" Holmes' brow lifted slightly. "Fate, my dear Watson, is the refuge of those too idle to observe cause and effect. Every so-called twist of fate is nothing more than the culmination of actions unnoticed, decisions unmade, and truths ignored until too late." He rose, crossing to the window, where the first streak of sunlight touched the fogged glass. "This case, for example, some would call it a story of cursed inheritance, or a fateful return of past sins. But strip away the poetry, and you have a daughter's grief, a villain's ambition, and a trail of evidence left in plain sight for anyone willing to read it." He turned back, his face illuminated by the thin morning light. "Time does not dispense justice, Watson. It merely waits for men like you and me to chase it down." I could not argue the point. Holmes's brilliance had once again shattered the illusion of mystery into its component parts: cause, consequence, and choice. Yet for all his logic, I sensed something almost melancholic in his tone, as though even Holmes himself wondered, now and then, whether some puzzles were meant to remain unsolved. The clock struck midnight as I sank into the armchair opposite Holmes, the familiar warmth of the fire curling around the room like an old friend. It had been a night of surprises, of revelations that felt as cold and mechanical as the very heart that had nearly claimed Holmes's life. Holmes had not flinched throughout the ordeal, of course, his mind as sharp and unyielding as ever. I, however, found myself profoundly disturbed by the entire affair. Perhaps it was the combination of science and superstition that left me unsettled. We sat there, in the glow of the firelight, a rare glass of cognac in hand, each lost in our thoughts. Holmes, silent as ever, seemed content in the warmth of his own satisfaction, while I could not shake the nagging feeling that something deeper lay beneath the surface of our victory. I took a long sip from my glass, the warmth of the cognac offering little solace to my troubled mind. Finally, I spoke, my voice betraying my discomfort. "Holmes," I began, "I must confess, this case has unsettled me more than most." Holmes did not react immediately. He simply raised an eyebrow, his gaze fixed upon the fire, as though he had already anticipated my admission. The unnerving blend of scientific precision and those whispered remnants of the supernatural. It leaves one to wonder whether everything can truly be explained, or if, in the end, There are forces in play that our logic cannot reach. Holmes's lips twitched, but he said nothing at first. Then, with a characteristic shrug, he replied, "The mind can bend itself into strange shapes, Watson. What we deem supernatural is often the puzzle we have yet to solve." Holmes leaned back, his eyes narrowing in the dim light as he studied the flickering shadows cast by the fire. "The true adversary in all of this, Watson," he said with a small smile, "is neither villain nor scheme." He paused, allowing the words to settle before continuing. "It is time itself." I blinked in confusion. "Time?" "Yes, time," Holmes replied, his voice calm. "It is always advancing, always indifferent to our struggles, our victories, our very existence. It moves relentlessly forward, like the tick of a clock, never pausing, never ceasing." "And what of the clockmaker?" I asked, a touch of skepticism creeping into my voice. Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, Watson, the clockmaker may create his traps, but it is time that is the true keeper of fate. The clockmaker and all of us are merely bound by its march." As I prepared to retire for the night, feeling the familiar weight of tiredness settle upon me, the doorbell rang, its sound sharp and sudden in the quiet house. Mrs. Hudson appeared, bearing a telegram, the slip of paper almost unnatural in its suddenness. I glanced at the message, my heart skipping a beat. The telegram read, "The sinister clockmaker still ticks. Beware the 13th hour." I handed it to Holmes, his eyes scanning the words with unfazed disinterest. His lips curled into a faint smile. "An encore," he murmured, as the clock's tick echoed through the silence. Holmes met my gaze, the faintest hint of amusement curling at the corners of his mouth. "I suppose," he said, "that we are not quite finished with this business yet." "But Holmes," I began, my voice tinged with frustration. This message, what does it mean? A new threat? Another case?" "Ah, Watson," he replied, his voice light but assured. "You know as well as I do that there are always more puzzles waiting to be solved. We are but temporary players in a much grander game." His calmness, so utterly unwavering, had always amazed me. But now, in the shadow of the telegram, I wondered how many of these cases were ever truly concluded. How many secrets remained hidden, buried beneath the gears of time. Holmes smiled as he stood, stretching with a casual grace. "You need not worry, Watson. I find the 13th hour to be quite fascinating." With that, he walked to his violin, his bow already poised to draw out another eerie, haunting melody. As we sat in our familiar armchairs by the fire, the case of the sinister clockmaker seemed to have settled into the quiet corners of our minds. Holmes, ever the enigma, stared into the flickering flames, his face illuminated by the dance of the firelight. "Watson," he began, his voice unusually soft. "Time, as I have said, is often the greatest mystery of all. It is relentless in its forward march, never stopping for us to consider its implications, its weight on our hearts, or the consequences of our actions." I raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this reflection was leading. "And do you mean to say that the clockmaker, his machinations, and even his heart were all simply games of time?" Holmes gave me a wry smile, but his eyes were distant. "Perhaps, but I believe, Watson, that the true mistake of every villain lies not in their designs, but in their failure to account for one simple truth. Time is an unyielding master, and no one escapes its grip. Not even the cleverest of minds, not even those who think themselves above it all." I couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration for his clarity, though I also sensed an unsettling truth beneath his words. Holmes turned to me, his gaze sharp and calculating, as though he had already solved the next puzzle, though it was not yet fully formed. "Tell me, Watson," he said, "what do you think was the criminal's greatest error in this case? Was it his reliance on mechanical devices, or was it the overconfidence that comes from thinking one can outsmart time itself?" I paused, considering the layers of deception and the intricate dance of gears and human folly that had unfolded before us. But, as always, Holmes had the answer, and I was left to wonder just how much I truly understood. As the fire crackled, I turned to the audience. "What do you think?" I asked, gesturing toward the mysterious world of Sherlock Holmes. Could the clockmaker's fatal flaw have been avoided? Was there a hidden clue we all missed? Holmes raised a finger in playful warning. And of course, if you enjoy these mysteries and the brilliance of deduction, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more cases that await your keen eye. Don't forget to share this tale with your friends. After all, there is no greater mystery than the one you solve with others. As Holmes returned to his violin, I sat back, pondering his words. The clock struck again, and I knew, as always, the game was never truly over.